Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. With the fallout from the Baton Rouge shooting still very much a part of the news, the New Orleans police chief offered advice this week about what to do when confronted by the police. We'll see what the chief says. We'll also look at 2 restaurant holdups and the impact of special districts. Another restaurant felt robbed in a different way by a food inspector, allegedly with her hands out. We'll look at these stories tonight, as well as the latest in the Irvin Mayfield investigation, 2 pleas in the Darren Sharper case, and as we mourn the events in France, the changing landscape of New Orleans as an international trade center. In our landscape are tonight's Informed Sources. Errrol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Mike Perlstein, investigative reporter, WWL-TV, Channel 4. Curt Sprang, reporter and anchor, WGNO-TV, Channel 26. And David Hammer, investigative reporter, WWL-TV, Channel 4. We're going to go over to Curt first. And in light of what's happened, the Baton Rouge shooting, the Minnesota shooting, then the shootings of police in Dallas, and just what's happened over the past week, our police chief, New Orleans police chief, Superintendent Harrison, has some advice for people about when they're stopped by cops.
Yeah, he released a videotape. They put it on social media, on their website, I believe, as well. And, you know, this deals with the big debates over these meetings between officers and, frankly, the people who have been shot in the past couple weeks. And they're dealing with how to handle a police officer, what to do if you are met or stopped by one. And, you know, we've talked about the issues in Baton Rouge and the one in Minnesota as well. And it's very controversial. People on one side say, look, we are harassed by police officers. When they come into our neighborhoods, we do not feel like they're our friends. Police are saying, look, when we tell you to do this and do this and do this, we expect you to do that. And so I think the police chief here wants to make it clear that when his officers say, stop, put your hands where I can see them, yada, yada, that's not where the negotiation begins from. That's not the point where you decide, okay, that's what you want me to do, but let's negotiate further here, and now let's talk about what I'm really going to do. And so the police chief put this video out and basically says, look, there are different steps that we take in situations depending on how you react and what the situation is. And it could be everything from just the presence of a police officer to I think next step up to actually having an officer put his hands on you, move you where he needed you to be, escalates more, using a baton, worst case scenario, pulling his gun and firing. And the police chief is basically just telling people, look, you know, keep your hands where they can be seen and obey the officer's wishes. That's
what I want to ask you. What is he really emphasizing in terms of if we're stopped by a police officer for whatever reason, a traffic stop, how should we react?
I think what he wants everybody to know is he wants his officers to feel safe, and if they feel safe, you should feel safe too. And a big part of that is having your hands where the officers can see them. But bottom line, he wants you to obey what the officers tell you to do. And there are all kinds of circumstances that could dictate what's going to happen. I'm going to go for my wallet now. Well, maybe he wants you to put your hands up. No, I'm going to get my wallet. No, put your hands up. No, I'm going to get my wallet. You know, that is where we're really going to see problems. And those are the problems he's trying to prevent.
Also on this video, I mean, he does list the various reasons why someone would be stopped and the rights of the police officer to stop individuals out there. So that's also something else that you can see. But he definitely urges that you follow what the police officer is saying. And if you have a beef with it, don't handle it there on the scene.
I think that's a big part of this, is that if you don't like what's happening, at the moment you're being stopped, that's not the time to fight back. That's not where you begin your protest, your case against the officer. If there's a problem with that, take it to the department, and they have people in place who can investigate. And frankly, over the years, they've done a lot of investigations of how their officers have handled situations.
And don't forget, we also have there is a police monitor too.
That's right.
In the city of New Orleans.
So now in New Orleans, police have body cams.
Right.
So a lot of what a citizen might allege is backed up by the camera.
And that's one of the big reasons that police departments have gone to those. You know, They want people to say, look, they want people to know that there are going to be video witnesses during these confrontations.
Well, they need it for protection for themselves in terms of the video, the body cams, but they have to release the video in an equivalent manner. They can't just release it when it exonerates the officer, and that's part of the problem in terms of public information.
Is that public record?
Well, we've had problems getting that record in the past, and they seem to they released it recently with an incident at the police station to show that why officers were fired. But there's certain times that they say, no, you can't have it because it's part of a pending investigation.
Part of an ongoing investigation. We hear that a lot.
Right.
And also there are cameras and video and audio on the tasers. Is that correct?
That is correct. And it's activated when the taser is used. It's pretty grainy. It's not quite as clear as the body cams that they're using now. But that's another one that we've requested that video and been denied as cases go through the administrative investigations by the department.
But NOPD is actually doing something, I think, forward-thinking, right, in terms of creating a database that's searchable of their video, right? Wasn't that a new initiative that they announced that was going to be like a pilot program, first in the nation type thing?
Well, the consent decree requires that they have body cams, but NOPD started with the body cams even before
the consent decree. It's funny, it got folded into the consent decree. It wasn't originally part of it. And they voluntarily, to help sort of clear some of these disputes, decided to do that, and now it is being monitored by the federal judge as part of the consent
So do
decree.
all police have body cams now? Like someone who stops you for a routine traffic stop, does that person have a body cam?
They should. In fact, with NOPD, any officer who's in patrol duty should have one. It's not true of all detectives, plainclothes, and others.
Does Jefferson Parish have body cams?
They do not.
They do not, yeah.
That's a hot topic, a source of conflict for sure, because the sheriff there does not want to have those cameras, and they had a police shooting a few weeks ago in New Orleans that started on the West Bank. And
where one of their deputies was shot to death.
And well, this was a case where one of their deputies shot somebody,
a different case
did not have a body cam, and people are thinking it's now becoming a standard. I think in New Orleans, people want to see the police body cam, but it's not available on all departments.
Okay, and as we start in this conversation, of course, all related to what happened in Baton Rouge over a week and a half ago, and the incidents that followed. You did a piece looking at the Baton Rouge Police Department. They did have body cams in that incident that we're talking about with Alton Sterling.
Right, but they said that they had fallen off or been dislodged. But I think a lot of what Curt was talking about in terms of establishing a protocol for dealing with police, it's all in the context of race. And we can't forget that, and that race carries with it, when a black person gets stopped, they may feel differently because of the historic context of this than a white person does, and they can follow some of the same protocols, and it may not help, or it hasn't helped in the past, and they think about that. And so I looked at the racial disparities of police forces, and I went through 296 cities across the country with over 100,000 people, and found that Baton Rouge is essentially the whitest police force for a majority black city in the country. So it really stood out. There are only 6 cities that are majority black populations in the country that have majority white police forces, and Baton Rouge is one of them. And the disparity of 25 percentage points between the 55% black population and the only 30% black police force is the largest.
So did you find that this police force had a lot of complaints lodged against it? I mean, how does the community and the police force get along?
Well, I don't know that it's out of whack in terms of complaints that are formally filed with internal affairs and things like that. What I did find from talking to experts in Baton Rouge was that they have raised concerns before. There was an incident in 2014 with some very racist text messages sent by a police officer that forced him to resign when it was exposed by WBRZ. And the people reacted to that and started having a conversation about needing more citizens councils overseeing things, discussing more about body cam footage and releasing that footage, and creating more understanding between the black community and the police force. In
the aftermath of the Alton Sterling shooting, what is the police force in Baton Rouge doing, the Baton Rouge Police Department? Well, that's a very good question, because specifically about racial disparities, we don't know, because I asked the police force to give me answers. They
gave me updated data through 2016 of their police force, which had basically stayed the same in terms of the percentages, but they didn't have an answer for me when I asked, what is the chief deputy doing to address this issue?
Okay, well, it's something that I'm sure we'll be looking at closely over the weeks to come. Thanks
Definitely.
a lot, both of you guys. I'm going to go over to Mike right now. And you did a couple of stories about restaurant inspection, which is done by the state.
Right, it's the State Department of Health, and this story first came to me in the form of a video which appeared to show a restaurant inspector taking food out of a restaurant in the French Quarter that she was in the process of inspecting. And it was pretty clear. The video follows her from the kitchen into the dining room, past the cash register, and out the door without any attempt to pay. And following that up with the restaurant, I found out that this inspector, this particular inspector, according to owner, manager, and basically all of the kitchen personnel and staff, said she had done that dozens of times before. And that got me, looking at her inspection records, and this particular restaurant and owner had complained about this inspector, not just because of the taking of food, but finding violations that they thought didn't exist or were not fair. And sure enough, in the most recent time that they went and complained and sat down with the supervisors in the regional office, number one, that particular inspector was removed from inspecting that restaurant, and number two, they reversed some 18 violations. So that got me to look a little bit at the bigger picture of how reliable are these scorecards, and the state posts these, they're searchable, different news organizations, websites, and there's even a phone app where they use the data from the State Department of Health and their findings of violations to rank and rate restaurants. And a lot of consumers use these in deciding, is that a clean restaurant to visit? This particular restaurant, turns out, had some legitimate gripes, and got a bunch of violations reversed. Now, as far as the individual inspector, I went and interviewed the head sanitarian up in Baton Rouge. She said that is strictly prohibited, and there's now a disciplinary investigation regarding that one employee. We were also looking at how widespread is that?
Yeah.
And I did talk to some other restaurant owners who basically told me, yes, that happens. It's happened in New Orleans for a long time, but they did not want to go on camera with their complaints, just out of fear that they could then become a target of inspectors. And
well, how often will a restaurant be inspected? Generally, should it be inspected?
Well, it depends on what they call the risk category of the restaurant, but most full-service restaurants, and especially if they deal with any seafood or any raw food that is cooked in their kitchen, it's going to be a risk category 4, meaning it'll be inspected 4 times a year. One of the complaints by this restaurant, the French Market restaurant down in Decatur in the French Quarter, was that they had been inspected way more than the 4 times a year. In fact, for several years running, they had been inspected 12 to 15 times a year. Some of that can be accounted for re-inspections after they find some critical violations. They're up for re-inspection. But even if you're re-inspected after each of the 4, you'd get 8. So
I thought it was interesting in your story how you showed that just the aggregate number of findings gets posted. So if you get inspected way more than the other guy, when you're competitors or whatever, it's going to look like you have more findings, like you're a dirtier restaurant or whatever.
So bottom line, is the state going to sort of change their method, do you think?
Well, the state said 2 things: that it has improved quite a bit since a legislative audit back in 2012 found that there was no formula or record keeping, and that it was really kind of up to the whims of a local office how many times a restaurant was inspected. They put it in sort of electronic calendar so that if everything works, the restaurant's supposed to be inspected the requisite number of times. But that wasn't happening. So they said, there's management changes. There has to be additional training of inspectors, and maybe some perfecting of the computer program that they basically built themselves to ensure that things are fair.
Well, we want to make sure that the public is safe, but it's also make or break for these businesses. So
High stakes for the
Yeah,
restaurants.
right, definitely. Okay, thanks a lot, Mike. We got to move on because we're starting to run over on everything, and I do want to get to Curt right now. Speaking about restaurants, there were two, one in Lakeview, and then last night uptown, who were confronted with armed robbers.
Yeah, not the kind of inspections that these restaurants want, for sure. No, in the Lakeview Harbor, we had two guys show up at closing time, go through a door that's normally locked, but it was unlocked because the workers were taking out trash. One uses a pistol to hold up the crew. One takes a rifle into the dining room and begins to try to rob the people there, the diners and the workers there. One worker bolts for the door. Our robber fires a shot and hits the hostess stand, and then just immediately they both bolt, and I think the whole thing lasted less than 60 seconds.
That was Lakeview Harbor, and the police showed up.
The police were there in 2 minutes, we're told. These were the officers that the Lakeview neighbors and businesses pay extra money for.
LCPD.
That's right. Those are the ones who showed up in 2 minutes. Now, we all know that the police department's had problems with its response time. We've heard averages, we've heard nightmare stories of it being an hour or more, or a 20-minute average, maybe 12-minute average now.
And
the chief wants to get to 7 minutes.
Yeah.
But if you want the 2-minute one, apparently you're going to all have to dig deeper into your pockets.
Because Noodle and Pie was robbed last night, and that was a successful robbery. They took money from the establishment, but there was a longer response time.
And I don't know what the response time for that was, but I think it's interesting when the department says, look, we had officers in the area, they were there in 2 minutes. Oh, and those are the ones that extra money is providing.
But again, in Lakeview, it's on Harrison Avenue, and there is a big concentration of restaurants in that area, whereas uptown they're more dispersed. So if I was a policeman, I'd be on Harrison Avenue myself. I think that'd be a place to be.
Yeah, well, especially if you're getting extra money to be there, right?
We did a story about the Lakeview Crime Prevention District and the Mid-City Security District having so much better response times than the NOPD, and that when the NOPD's own regular units have to respond in those areas, they're much slower.
And of course, last year we saw this just sort of spate of restaurant robberies. There are 4 suspects who are in jail, right, for those robberies.
The FBI jumped in on that, and they very painstakingly built a case against 4 suspects.
But now we see 2 in basically 2 nights, 48 hours. So I hope it's not a repeat.
Yeah, you'd hope that when everybody pays their money for police protection and they all chip in for it, I mean, if you really want great police protection, is it going to require neighborhoods to get together and pitch in to get the extra patrols? Is that what it's going to take?
And a lot of neighborhoods do that. They pay extra to get those.
And what about the ones who can't?
So,
and bottom line is the NOPD is so short-staffed that the wait time is what it is. The response times are
Of course,
slow.
earlier this year, given the chance to increase property tax, people voted no.
Exactly.
So.
Well, we'll continue to discuss this, I'm sure. Also, I'm going to go over to Errrol now. And tragedy in France yesterday. And you wanted to talk about how New Orleans International Status is
just got
somewhat
to
changing.
think about New Orleans as an international setting. The French consul in New Orleans used to be a major consul. It governed a 5-state area. It still has this place uptown, and there still is a French consul general assigned to New Orleans, but now his jurisdiction is Louisiana, and he answers to the one I believe in Houston now. So a lot of the consul generals, there are 59 consulates in New Orleans now. I can count 3 that have a full-time consulate. Mexico is one, and Honduras is the other, and the other is all has honorary consulates, and that's not unusual. I mean, that's happening around the world, especially once the Soviet bloc opened. A lot of countries saw new opportunities to go, and they have limited budgets, and so they're putting their consulates there. The internet has opened up new possibilities, but all of this happening at the same day that would maybe the final delay in developing the World Trade Center was there's going to be an appeals, but essentially the judge threw out the lawsuit, and it made me think, well, this is. I mean, it's great there's going to be a 4 seasons, but just look what's happening, that we don't have a World Trade Center anymore. There used to be an International Trade Mart, and when these buildings were built, they were built to house all these councils, to be like centers of international trade. And so that part of the scene doesn't exist anymore, even though we still I mean, we're still in an international city, and we're still in the World Trade Center, and the Four Seasons is going to still be what's called Spanish Plaza. But just the whole council course situation has changed.
But
you know that France's assemblyman representing French in the all French people in the United States actually lives in New Orleans, Damien Regnard. He's an elected representative of French people in the United States.
Well, certainly New Orleans, the state of Louisiana, still has very close connections to France. And also, as you pointed out, with the World Trade Center redevelopments, Four Seasons, that is still being challenged. They say they are going to appeal the dismissal of the lawsuit. So we'll see ultimately where that goes. I want to go over to David right now. And following up on the Irvin Mayfield, which you did a series of investigative reports for which you won a Press Club Award. Congratulations on that. But now we see that Mayfield has stepped down as artistic director, is it, of the New
artistic director and as a board member for the New Orleans Jazz Orchestra. And there was a story in today's Washington Post actually summarizing the whole thing and putting it out there for a national audience. So, you know, it's definitely, and it's starting to hurt, I think, the jazz orchestra and the jazz market, which is a terrific project. But, you know, $10 million project, it took $1 million from the Library Foundation that maybe it didn't need to get the project done. And now that's the basis of all these problems.
So he has stepped down as creative director, artistic director.
Right.
Is Irvin Mayfield still performing with the orchestra?
He has some, they said that he still has some contractual obligations going forward, but essentially he's breaking ties, and they need that in order to be able to sustain themselves. You know, the leadership, it's a nonprofit. Now, whether you agree that it should be or shouldn't be, it's still an operation that needs to continue to perform. It's gotten donations over the years, and it needs to be a steward of that money, and it's losing money because of Irvin Mayfield and the perception of him after my stories have come out.
There was something I've been wondering about. In one of your reports, you talked about his going to New York and staying, I think it was at the Ritz-Carlton.
Correct.
And having a breakfast for $100,000 for one person.
$1,400.
Oh, sorry, $1,400.
We don't know how many people attended. It was a breakfast for
What exactly did he have for breakfast? Do you know?
We don't know, and I know that some people at NOLA.com seized on that to say, what can you get in New Orleans for $1,400 for breakfast, and a number of beignets you can buy or whatever. I mean, the bill doesn't detail who was there and how many people were there. The point is, he wasn't even doing any Library Foundation business according to the records, and it was billed to NoJo and to him at NoJo, but it ended up being paid by the Library Foundation.
And speaking of the money owed to the Library Foundation, there was a deal that was struck with a certain amount of cash out of the $1 million that would go to them over 5 years, and then the rest in kind. I mean, there's opposition to that agreement.
People are upset, including people on the library board itself, that it was not in totality going to be paid back. It's going to be paid back $483,000 over 5 years in cash, the rest in in-kind contributions. And as has been pointed out by many people, who's going to go to support those concerts now that they're supposed to have benefit concerts to cover the rest of it? And if the NoJo can't survive, then the question becomes, are they going to be able to pay all of that $483,000 in cash back because they got 5 years to do it? So the survival of the NoJo and the jazz orchestra and the jazz market is critical for this going forward and for taking care of this debt.
Okay, Library Foundation now headed by Bob Brown, right?
Correct.
NoJo, it still exists, and they're still performing, and they're at the jazz market. That's all still in business.
Correct. And it's still, the chairman is still Ron Foreman.
Okay. All righty. Thanks a lot, David. Okay, I'm going to go over back to Mike now. And it would seem that the Darren Sharper case now has been resolved. There have been pleas among the three defendants, Darren Sharper and the other two.
Right. We still have the formal sentencing of Darren Sharper yet to come, and the number of years that he's going to serve in prison is still up to the judge. But in something of a surprise, on the week that the trial for these two co-defendants was to begin, on the very first day of jury selection, one of those defendants, Eric Nunez, announced a plea deal in which his sentence will be capped at 10 years. And he admitted participating in a drugging and raping along with Darren Sharper at Darren Sharper's condo in the Warehouse District. At that point, the jury selection continued for the second co-defendant, Brandon Lichardi, a former St. Bernard Parish Sheriff's deputy who was a little more deeply involved, had been accused of independent rape on his own, of supplying drugs to Darren Sharper, and having some knowledge of the other incident with Eric Nunez. That jury was selected. They were ready to go ahead with that trial with opening statements and testimony when, I guess, with all of the evidence and now Eric Nunez joining Darren Sharper as a potential witness against him, he cut his own deal. And that deal is for 17 years in prison. So for all of those journalists, perhaps more than anybody, who were anxiously awaiting a spectacular trial, this was such a sensational story and was coast to coast. And we had the prospect of Darren Sharper taking the witness stand to help himself. He is now not going to get the kind of credit for taking a witness stand and helping prosecutors at trial. So he's still in the balance for as many as 20 years, which, as you remember, he originally cut a deal to get 9 years on top of the 1 additional year he had already served, and the federal judge, Jane Trish Malazzo, said, no, that's not enough.
She rejected that.
And she rejected that sentence, and they sort of recalculated the plea deal to now he's up to 20. But that was, again, contingent on his cooperation, which really wasn't needed with the 2 co-defendants pleading guilty.
So we could end up in a situation where Shardy would get more time in jail than Sharper, right?
It's possible. Right now, the range on Darren Sharper is 15 to 20 years, and considering that it was some 15 victims in 4 different states in a global plea deal, he's going to have a pre-sentence investigation that is going to be rather tough, and I do think the judge has shown a little bit of her hand rejecting the 10 years. He's going to get significant years.
And this was in federal court, and so all the state charges are, this resolves everything in New Orleans?
Right, well,
and you got to tell me this in 2 seconds.
Yeah, the state court basically came up with plea deals to match the number of years in federal court, so everything runs concurrent.
Okay, Mike, thanks. Over to Errrol, looking ahead.
The Downtown Development District is donating $10,000 to the police for more security cameras downtown. They're going to evaluate where to put them, but the first place will be on the first block of Royal Street.
Okay, Mike?
Well, first, congratulations to Errrol for a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Press Club of New Orleans.
Yes, very nice affair last week.
Back in the news of police shootings, there was the one police shooting we referred to earlier by Jefferson Parish Sheriff's deputies of Eric Harris in New Orleans after a car chase. I understand that case is pretty close to being resolved and a final result of that investigation announced. There was some delay in that because of all of these other shootings and the protests that followed, but look for that in the coming weeks.
Okay, Mike, Curt.
And Coach Sean Payton with the Saints gets his players to bust their tails for him, but if you want to see him sweat, check out the NFL Network's interview of him where his daughter, a Pepperdine student and intern at the NFL Network, is asking the questions and asks things like, what really happened to the family dog and which players can I date? You want to see a guy sweat.
That would definitely make a dad sweat. Okay, thanks, David.
Well, a few weeks ago, I promised you a story about coastal erosion. It's finally going to air Tuesday night.
Okay.
And I think you'll find it very interesting, some new angles that people haven't thought of.
Very important issue. Okay, guys, thanks a lot for being here. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.